Hi, my name is Julie Kay, and I'm a sociology professor and a settler living and working in Amiskwaciy-Waskahigan, or Edmonton, in Treaty 6 territory. I'm reading from the section called The Imperial Context from the Executive Summary of the Truth and Reconciliation Report. This is pages 47 to 53. The Imperial Context. The whole part of the residential school was part of a bigger scheme of colonization. There was intent. The schools were there with the intent to change people, to make them like others, and to make them not fit. And today, we have to learn to decolonize. That comes from Shirley Flowers' statement to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. The mandate of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada requires it to report on the history, purpose, operation, and supervision of Canada's residential schools. These schools were part of a process that brought European states and Christian churches together in a complex and powerful manner. The history of the schools can be best understood in the context of this relationship between the growth of global European-based empires and the Christian churches. Starting in the 16th century, European states gained control of indigenous peoples' lands throughout the world. It was an era of mass migration. Millions of Europeans arrived as colonial settlers in nearly every part of the world. Millions of Africans were transported in the European-led slave trade, in which coastal Africans collaborated. Traders from India and China spread throughout the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, bringing with them indentured servants whose lives were little different from those of slaves. The activities of explorers, farmers, prospectors, trading companies, or missionaries often set the stage for expansionary wars. The negotiation of the breaking of treaties, attempts at cultural assimilation, and the exploitation and marginalization of the original inhabitants of the colonized lands. Over time, Indigenous children in places as distant from one another as East Africa, Australia, and Siberia would be separated from their parents and sent to residential schools. The spread of European-based empires was set in motion in the 15th century when the voyages of maritime explorers revealed potential sources of new wealth to the monarchs of Europe. The Spanish conquest of the Aztecs and the Incas gave Spain and ultimately all of Europe access to the resources of North and South America. This not only enriched the Old World, but also unleashed an unceasing wave of migration, trade, conquest, and colonization. It marked the beginning of the creation of a European-dominated global economy. Although it was led initially by Spain and Portugal, this area of imperial expansion came to be directed by Holland, France, and in the end, most stunningly, by Britain. Empires were established militarily. They engaged in extensive and violent wars with one another, maintained a military presence on their frontiers, and conducted innumerable military campaigns to put down nationalist uprisings. Colonies were established to be exploited economically. The benefit of empire could come directly as taxes, as precious metals, or as raw materials for industries in homeland. Colonies often were required to purchase their imports solely from the homeland, making them a captive market. The mere presence of indigenous people in these new colonized lands blocked settler access to the land. To gain control of the land, indigenous people, colonists negotiated treaties, waged wars of extinction, eliminated traditional landholding practices, disrupted families, and imposed a political and spiritual order that came complete with new values and cultural practices. Treaty promises often went unfulfilled. The United States General Tecumseh Sherman is quoted as having said, "We have made more than 1,000 treaties with the various Indian tribes and have not kept one of them." In commenting on Sherman's statement in 1886, C.C. Painter, a critic of American Indian policy, observed that the United States had never intended to keep them. They were not made to be kept, but to serve a present purpose, to settle a present difficulty in the easiest manner possible, to acquire a desired good with the least possible compensation, and then to be disregarded as soon as this purpose was tainted, and we were strong enough to enforce a new and more profitable arrangement. The outcome was usually disastrous for Indigenous people. While the chief beneficiaries of empire were the colonists and their descendants, many of the colonies settled grew up to be among grew to be among the most prosperous societies in the late 19th and early 20th century world. Settler colonies often went on to gain political independence. In the case of Canada and the United States of America, these newly created nations spread across North America. As they expanded, they continued to incorporate Indigenous peoples and their lands into empires. Colonialism remains an ongoing process, shaping both the structure and the quality of relationship between the settlers and Indigenous peoples. At their height, the European empires laid claim to most of the Earth's surface and controlled the seas. Numerous arguments were advanced to justify such extravagant interventions into the lands and lives of other peoples. These were largely elaborations on two basic concepts. One, the Christian God had given the Christian nations the right to colonize the lands they discovered as long as they converted the indigenous populations. And two, the Europeans were bringing the benefits of civilization, a concept that was intertwined with Christianity, to the heathen. In short, it was contended that people were being colonized for their own benefit, either in this world or in the next. In the 15th century, the Roman Catholic Church, building on the traditions of the Roman Empire, conceived of itself as the guardian of a universal world order. The adoption of Christianity within the Roman Empire, which defined itself as civilized, reinforced the view that to be civilized was to be Christian. The Catholic papacy was already playing a role in directing and legitimizing colonialism prior to Christopher Columbus's voyages to the Americas in the 1490s, largely by granting Catholic kingdoms the right to colonize the lands they discovered. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued the first of four orders, referred to as papal bulls, a term that takes its name from the Latin American word for the mold used to seal the document, that granted most of North and South America to Spain, the kingdom that had sponsored Columbus's voyages of the preceding year. These orders helped shape the political and legal arguments that have come to be referred to as the doctrine of discovery, which was used to justify the colonization of the Americas in the 16th century. In return, the Spanish were expected to convert the indigenous peoples of Americas to Christianity. Other European rulers rejected the Pope's ability to give away sovereignty of over half the world. But they did not necessarily reject the doctrine of discovery. They simply modified it. The English argued that a claim to discovered lands was valid if the discoverer was able to take possession of them. Harman Verslitz, who promoted the colonization in the 18th century of what is now the southern coast of the United States, wrote that this right arising from the first discovery is the first and fundamental right of all European nations as their claim to lands in America. This doctrine of discovery was linked to the second idea, that lands being claimed were terra nullius, no man's land, and therefore open to claim. On the basis of this concept, the British government claimed ownership of the entire Australian continent. There, the doctrine of terra nullius remained the law until it was successfully challenged in court in 1992. Under this doctrine, imperialists could argue that the presence of indigenous people did not void a claim of terra nullius, since the indigenous people simply occupied rather than owned the land. True ownership, they claimed, could come only with European-style agriculture. Underlying these arguments was the belief that the colonizers were bringing civilization to savage people, who could never civilize themselves. The civilizing mission rested on a belief of racial and cultural superiority. European writers and politicians often arranged racial groups in a hierarchy, which each with their own set of mental and physical capabilities. The special gifts of the Europeans meant it was inevitable that they would conquer the lesser peoples. Beneath the Europeans, in descending order, were Asians, Africans, and the indigenous people of the Americas and Australia. Some people held that Europeans had reached the pinnacle of civilization through a long and arduous process. In this view, the other peoples of the world had been held back by such factors as climate, geography, and migration. Through a civilizing process, Europeans could, however, raise the people of the world up to their level. This view was replaced in the 19th century by a racism that chose to cloak itself in the language of science, and held that the peoples of the world had differing abilities. Some argued that for genetic reasons, there were limits on the ability of the less developed peoples to improve. In some cases, it was thought contact with superior races could lead to only one outcome: the extinction of the inferior peoples. These ideas shaped global policies towards Indigenous people. In 1883, Britain's Lord Rosebery, a future British Prime Minister, told an Australian audience, "It is on the British race, whether in Great Britain or the United States or in the colonies or wherever it may be, that rest the highest hopes of those who try to penetrate the dark future, or who seek to raise and better the patient masses of mankind." Residential schools were established in the shadow of these ideas. In the year that Rosebery gave his speech, the Canadian government operated its first industrial residential school for Aboriginal people at Battleford on the Canadian prairies. The Christian churches not only provided the moral justification for the colonization of other people's lands, they also dispatched missionaries to the colonized nations in order to convert the heathen. From the 15th century on, the Indigenous peoples of the world were the objects of a strategy of spiritual and cultural conquest that had its origins in Europe. While they often worked in isolation and under difficult conditions, missionaries were representative of worldwide organizations that enjoyed the backing of influential individuals in some of the most powerful nations of the world, and which came to amass considerable experience in transforming different cultures. Residential schools figured prominently in missionary work, not only in Canada, but also around the world. Christian missionaries played a complex but central role in the European colonial project. Their presence helped justify the extension of empires, since they were visibly spreading the word of God to the heathen. If their efforts were unsuccessful, the missionaries might conclude that those who refused to accept the Christian message could not expect the protection of the church or of the law, thus clearing the way for their destruction. Although missionaries often attempted to soften the impacts of imperialism, they were also committed to making the greatest changes in the culture and psychology of the colonized. They might, for example, seek to have traders give fair prices and to have government officials provide relief in times of need, but they also worked to undermine relationships to the land, language, religion, family relations, educational practices, morality, and social custom. Missionary zeal was also fueled by the often violent division that had separated the Christian world into Catholic and Protestant churches. Both Catholics and Protestants invested heavily in the creation of missionary organizations that were intended to engage overseas missionary work. The most well-known Catholic orders were the Franciscans, the Jesuits, and the Oblates. The Oblates originally focused their attention on the poor and working classes of France, but from the 1830s onward, they engaged in overseas missionary work. They established themselves in eastern Canada, the Pacific Northwest, Ceylon, Texas, and Africa. The Oblates administered a majority of the Roman Catholic residential schools in Canada. They could not have done this work without the support of numerous female religious orders, most particularly the Sisters of Charity, the Grey Nuns, the Sisters of Providence, the Sisters of St. Anne's, and the Missionary Oblate Sisters of the Sacred Heart and of Mary Immaculate. The British-based Church Missionary Society was also a global enterprise. By middle of the 19th century, this Anglican society had missions across the globe in such places as India, New Zealand, West and East Africa, China, and the Middle East. The Society's Highbury College in London provided missionaries with several years of training in arithmetic, grammar, history, geography, religion, education, and the administration of schools. By 1901, the Church Missionary Society had an annual income of over £300,000. It used this money to support 510 male missionaries, 326 unmarried females, and 365 ordained pastors from around the world. The Catholics and Anglicans were not the only European-based missionary societies to take up work in Canada. Presbyterians and Methodists, originally drawing support from the United Kingdom, undertook missionary work among Aboriginal people in the early 19th century. On the coast of Labrador, members of the Moravian Brotherhood, an order that has its origins in what is now the Czech Republic, carried out missionary work from the early 18th century onwards. Protestant missionary work also depended on the often underpaid and voluntary labor of missionary wives and single women who had been recruited by missionary societies. Missionaries viewed Aboriginal culture as a barrier to both spiritual salvation and the ongoing existence of Aboriginal people. They were determined to replace traditional economic pursuits with European-style peasant agriculture. They believed that cultural transformation required the imposition of social control and separation from both traditional communities and European settlements. In light of these beliefs, it is not surprising that they were proponents of an educational world that separated children from the influence of their families and cultures, imposed a new set of values and beliefs, provided basic elementary education, and created institutions whose daily life reflected Europe's emerging work discipline. In short, they sought to impose the foreign and transforming world of the residential school. Colonization was undertaken to meet the perceived needs of the imperial powers. The justification offered for colonialism, the need to bring Christianity and civilization to the indigenous peoples of the world, may have been a sincerely and firmly held belief, but as a justification for intervening in the lives of other peoples, it does not stand up to legal, moral, or even logical scrutiny. The papacy had no authority to give away lands that belonged to indigenous people. The doctrine of discovery cannot serve as the basis for a legitimate claim to lands that were colonized, if for no other reason than that the so-called discovered lands were already well known to the indigenous people who inhabited them for thousands of years. The wars of conquest that took place to strip indigenous people of their lands around the globe were not morally just wars. Indigenous people were not, as colonists often claimed, subhuman, and neither were they living in violation of any universally agreed upon set of values. There was no moral imperative to impose Christianity on the indigenous peoples of the world. They did not need to be civilized. Indeed, there is no hierarchy of societies. Indigenous people had systems that were complete unto themselves and met their needs. Those systems were dynamic, they changed over time, and were capable of continued change. Taken as a whole, the colonial process relied for its justification on the sheer presumption of taking a specific set of European beliefs and values and proclaiming them to be universal values that could be imposed upon the peoples of the world. This universalizing of European values, so central to the colonial project that was extended to North America, served as the prime justification and rationale for the imposition of a residential school system on the Indigenous peoples of Canada.